Tolkien left a lot of unfinished stories, and I guess I'm thinking, was that a tragedy or was it part of his triumph? And we'll talk about that today. Currently reading with my book group on Discord, we're reading Unfinished Tales, which is the most niche of the four big books that I think most Tolkien readers would recognise. That's Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales. And it's because it's unfinished, it's kind of all full of all the very long fragments, some nearly finished, that Tolkien wrote. And they really fill in stuff about Middle-earth. This is the Middle-earth stuff. Here's a weird thing though. You think, oh yeah, so we've Tolkien, best fantasy novel ever, in Lord of the Rings. Sorry, Hobbit fans. But oh great novel, this fantastic novel, definition in the genre, genius, love this stuff. But he published very little in his lifetime. I mean, he more or less net published The Hobbit. I think is pretty much his first published thing. I think he published some non-Middle-earth short stories. Tales from the Perilous Realm is his current name. I don't know if that was his original one. I think some of the stories came out individually, like Roverandom, I think, came out separately. Farmer Giles of Ham. Smith of Wood Major and Leaf by Niggle. This also has the appendix of major talk and essay he published on fairy stories. This contains, my version contain the expanded Adventures of Tom Bombadil. Adventures of Tom Bombadil is a poetry collection, which is presented as part of I think, is it from the Red Book? It's a collection of relevant poems anyway from the Shire. So it's technically, and we'll get to that in a second, canon as far as it goes for Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings. That's what he published. He published functionally some short stories, a poetry collection, 2 novels, plus a major essay on storytelling, and then obviously he did professional stuff as well. He had a hobby, Middle-earth, which took up lots of his time. He had a family, he had a career. And so, writing wasn't his main income, and it wasn't, in that sense, his main interest. I think his hobby of Middle-earth led organically into writing, and he enjoyed writing. There's no way you get him, you sell. He was just a philologist who ended up making up stories to explain philology. Well, no, I think that was a springboard. But most of what he wrote about Middle-earth, particularly his great hobby, was never published by him in his lifetime. He wrote reams and reams of stuff, and not just all the drafts of books, though that fills many volumes of history of Middle-earth, but he also wrote a ton of other stories. And for him, one of the most important stories of all, the Silmarillion, was not published in his lifetime. It was edited by his son and published relatively soon after his death. If he dies, does he die 73? This is published 77. And this is basically because the Silmarillion is substantially complete, with caveats, when he dies. What's in this book, that is to say. But the expanded versions of many of the 3 great lays of Beleriand, of Tuor, of Turin, and of Beren and Lúthien, and of Eärendil, these great lays, they are never finished or published by him. He's interested in publishing the Silmarillion, but it's clear after the success of The Hobbit, but it's clear that's not what the publisher's interest is, and he writes Lord of the Rings instead. Why is there such a problem in getting stuff out? There's a separate issue where, does contribute to this. We're still editing and working out kind of fairly important details of characters' lives. Celeborn, for instance, right up to the end of his death, even though in the 50s he had established the canon, as it were, for that character. And though it's much more minor, you see the Hobbit change to match Lord of the Rings. So he sees this stuff as kind of constantly in development, and he's constantly thinking about stuff. He's constantly trying to perfect his creation. This means that not very much gets published. And that is certainly in some cases, some senses, a shame. And I think in most ways I'd react to it thinking, this is very sad. What I mean, let's say the Silmarillion, which is a great book. I thoroughly recommend it. I think you've got to take it on its own terms, understand what genre it is. If you don't want the genre it is, which is of kind of myth and legend and saga, don't read it. But if you do, it's great. It's one of the best. You can come to it and really get a lot from it. We loved reading it. I've read it 3 times. It's been great every time. Now, the only thing there are 4 shorter stories, 2 which are kind of prehistory, you know, like real mythological, angelic world creation stuff. Then there's a story of the Second Age, the downfall of Numenor, and then there's the Rings of Power in the Third Age, which is a summary of these great events in the Second to Third Age, which lead up to the events of Lord of the Rings and the end of the Third Age. And basically, all of these were finished by Tolkien in one sense. There's some unstable textual things going on in a few, but they're all mostly finished, but they're not all fully revised. The Quenta Silmarillion, the main body of First Age storytelling about the rebellion of the Noldor and the hunt for the Silmarils, is revised in the 50s, but the revision doesn't reach some of basically the last 3 chapters, particularly of the Ruin of Doriath, of Tuor and the Fall of Gondolin, and of the Voyage of Eärendil and the War of Roth. That is 30 pages total, and that includes an exceptionally important pair of stories in terms of the great heroes of that period, in terms of Tuor and the Voyage of Eärendil, and it involves the Fall of Doriath. But that's because these were finished in the 30s. I think it's the 30s revision that most of the text comes from, and then revised. Christopher Tolkien actually does harmonise them a bit, and he later says he regrets it. I think he's probably wrong to, in lots of ways. I think his sense of what is most harmonic is, and what works best is basically right. But yeah, the Silmarillion is great, and it's great that there was fundamentally a complete text with this slight lack at the back end, at the very finale, because it hadn't been expanded in the final revision that he was making. But beyond that, you know, there's a bunch of stuff that doesn't get anywhere near finished. Unfinished Tales includes the nearly finished expanded version of the Nanahin Húrin, the Children of Húrin, and that's kind of long. That's I guess something like, it's 140 pages, nearly 130 pages or so of core text here of narrative, and it would be longer, I think, in a finished version, because the events that have to be summarised or that are partially missing, the one section that's missing, are massive things in the story of Turin. So you've got this big, really for him, maybe the definitional story of the First Age. He writes most of a short novel on it, but it's not quite finished. Of Tuor His Coming to Gondolin, and indeed anything afterwards, we have very little late finished material. We have a foreshortened version of just Tuor arriving at Gondolin. In the Silmarillion itself, he doesn't revise that section or expand it. We have this thing called the Aldarion Arendis, the one proper narrative of life on Numenor that isn't about the downfall. It's not finished, though it's fairly lengthy. And you have things like the various small texts and partial essays on stuff like Círdan and Eorl, the Battle of the Fords of Isen, and the history of Galadriel and Celeborn, and of Amroth, King of Lorien. You have the partially complete essays. These are not fiction in the same way; they're not narrative. Of the Druidai and the Astari, the Palantiri, all these kind of interesting things which he wrote either long partial essays on, or he didn't quite finish. And he even has a couple of, so, you know, we're talking about a lot of major stories for him, as well as non-fiction, inverted commas, about the world, you know, just essays about the world, and kind of secondary narratives. And we also have, and this is the two contained, they're both contained in volume 12 of History of Middle-earth, which is the textual history, the peoples of Middle-earth. What's interesting here is there are two final, this is an interesting volume because this is more or less, it's not every late text or every unfinished text that isn't elsewhere. You still get stuff coming out in the kind of the semi-approved zines into the 90s and noughties. I think even up maybe fairly close, only a few years ago there's something. But, you know, the remains of essays that maybe were just too incomplete or too vague. Here you get a few late writings, the Shibboleth of Feanor, the Problem of Ross, of Dwarves and Men. You get the teachings of Pengelod, and then you get these two unfinished tales. You get 13 pages of something called The New Shadow and 17 pages of Tal Elmar. And this includes some notes from Christopher Tolkien as well, in instructions and stuff. So it's not quite that long. But those are two novels, which basically are 10-page novels. They are tiny fragments. The New Shadow is the sequel to Lord of the Rings. Tal Elmar is a story of a Middle-earther during the Numenorean expansion. So you have this completely unique perspective on what's happening. He is fairly enlightened. There is something high and mighty in his spirit. but he is not a Numenorean. He sees them coming, and he also kind of sees the darkness of a continent influenced by Sauron and so on, because he's further south. He's not up in the kind of northern area ruled by elves. So yeah, you've got, again, 2 novels there that don't get very far at all. And so there's a few things. One, it's very natural to think, wow, wouldn't it be great to have finished versions of those? And some of them, they're so close to being finished, say the Quenta Silmarillion, or maybe, of the long version of Turin, or of Aldarin Arendis. And I'll talk slightly more about those, not in detail, but just to touch on some of what's special about them. Or these new novels, they sound fascinating. They both actually, I've discussed them before, they both are both very well written. The New Shadow is 10 pages of a very good novel that never otherwise came to be, of what would have been presumably 500 or 1,000 pages, but never came to be. Very good. Or maybe it'd be shorter. It was a thriller, so maybe it was 300 pages. So yeah, I can't help but feel the loss. And we all should feel the loss in a sense of like, this supreme creator who wrote the best fantasy novel. On the other hand, this is the other thing that strikes me. There's one thing which is just about some of the ways he was thinking and the problems he was niggling at in the last few years of his life are ones which I don't think we're going to end up improving Middle-earth, suffice to say. So, for instance, he became anxious about needing to communicate the fact that these were kind of the legendary prehistory of Earth, and so, of course, in that Earth, because it's meant to be a prehistory of our Earth, the world could never have been flat, it would always been round. This is obviously, I'm afraid that this is misunderstanding his own theory of subcreation, I think, for instance, and I think Christopher Tolkien, abandoning that and not even worrying about trying to integrate that into the Silmarillion is quite right. Addressing that stuff just as straightforward history, saga history, but history. Or again, he has a recurring thing about, what do we do about clearing up Galadriel's reputation? There's things which are not improving anything. So you're not saying, not that there are very interesting late writings, but it's not that everything he ever wrote or everything he ever thought was right and good. So in that sense, it's okay we don't get all of it, As it is, we get 3, let's say, including the Silmarillion, excellent books, really excellent books that are fundamentally complete. And of those, you get one that's about dwarves, you get The Hobbit, ironically. You get one that's about humans and hobbits, i.e. the Lord of the Rings, named for an angel. And you get one about elves, the Silmarillion, named for some jewels. He covers the big races of Middle-earth, and he gives them great stories. He does so much that is so complete in itself. So why do we need more? And I think maybe finally also there's a thing that comes to mind about, I guess you could put it in a couple of ways. One, The New Shadow, my impression of what I've read about what his notes are, what Christopher Tolkien says, his father said, not Christopher Tolkien himself thinks it's very interesting. But essentially he just found it depressing and pointless. He didn't want to write The New Shadow. And though I don't think what you read does not make me think it's a depressing and pointless story, all the magic has gone away. There's something there about trusting an author's instinct, right? That maybe he's just like, look, I don't have a passion for this project. I can't see how this would work. So I'm not going to do it. That's surely, something you got to respect the author for. He was never promising this. There's no Kickstarter backing this. There's no kind of, I'm writing a 3-book series and the last one will be The New Shadow. Oh, no, wait, I'm just really having trouble doing this. Please, by the way, I'm writing scripts for a TV show about Lord of the Rings. There's none of this. There's a thing he did, he shelved. Same with Tel Elmar, which I don't think he ever said I think he seemed to be working on into the late 60s even. There's some hints it was on his mind. But Tel Elmar, again, if he didn't have, it's only 10 pages long or something, if he didn't have stuff for it, if he didn't know, he conceives of it as a big story of this guy going around the world, and he didn't get much of it down. It wasn't exciting him. I guess maybe one thing was he had no immediate audience for it, and that complicates it again. Is why was he writing the narratives? He wrote the philological essays because as he was noodling around, he'd suddenly be like, is this name wrong? Do I need to change this name? If it is right, why would it be right? Let's come up with a cool story for why it's that name. That's very cool. And it gives us narrative sections. But the point is, that was what he was often doing in his hobby time on Middle-earth. The narratives came. The Hobbit was a kid's story he wrote, because of reading to his kids. The same with something like Rover Random. Lord of the Rings is because he's asked, can you write another book? And he's not allowed to give them the Silmarillion, which is what he's been spending 20 years on, more or less, the stories of the Noldor. So he writes something else, and it turns out to be the best fantasy novel ever. So in that, and he doesn't feel any great pressure to finish or write anything for publication from the 50s onwards. So maybe there's also a thing where it's sheer luck, it's sheer providence what gets finished and what doesn't, in which case maybe we would prefer him to finish X rather than Y. It's very hard for me to know exactly what I wish he'd finished, what I wish he hadn't. In a sense, I miss all of this stuff. I think you can just imagine if he had really exerted his power to write Tel Elmar or to finish Aldarion and Arendis, and you can imagine some of these being a compilation maybe of different texts. Matt, how much, even if it's that he didn't finish them, but he wrote another 50 pages of them or something, you'd be like, 50 pages of this amazing book. So, and I can't help but feel that, but part of me also thinks we got what we got, and that was partly because that's what he wanted to write, and that's what he ended up writing. And there's a thing about his perfectionism which feeds into this, that the things he wrote were perfect or nigh on perfect. The things he published, and the Silmarillion is a weird literary miracle in that sense, is that it is so close to being finished that a really sensitive editor, and I think his son was a very sensitive editor, can kind of get it there. And so in that case, that goes back to my point about trusting the author's instinct, is he knew when he was happy with something, he knew what he wanted to do, and that produced The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and virtually all of, basically the current form that Silmarillion is all his completed writing, with literally a couple of linking sentences from Chris Tolkien. And so maybe, though I want more, I'm driven back on accepting that what we got was right in meat. We're not talking about a young talent killed in an accident, tragic accident or something. We're talking about someone, a writer who wrote what he wanted to write, who had the time. He always wanted to write more, but he had the time to write what he wanted to write. And we got what we got out of it. And that's probably enough. I don't know. I certainly, though that is my conclusion, I think it does not mean I do not go back and think, man, I wish in the 50s he'd had a bit more time and he'd just finished that Silmarillion revision, or I wish that he'd, really in the 60s really just wanted to write Tel Elmar. I can't help but thinking that, but I understand that that's probably not right. But anyway, you tell me your thoughts. Do you think actually really he should have written more of this stuff, or there's some stuff amongst his unfinished writing you wish specifically was finished, or do you take a different view on all that? Anyway, tell me all of those ideas in the comments, and I'll see you next time.